said, today's webinar is presented by Terry Woodnorth and Roy Birkenbosch. Terry Woodnorth was the task force chair, and he lives in upstate New York and is a member of Valley CRC in Binghamton, New York. He served 3 terms as a deacon, previously served as president of the Atlantic Northeast Diaconal Conference, and currently serves as a trustee for the Center for Public Justice. Roy Birkenbosch, the task force reporter, teaches theology and is the director of the Micah Center and Interdisciplinary Studies at the King's University College in Edmonton, Alberta. He's also a theological advisor to World Renew. Terry and Roy, I'm turning it over to you, and Terry's going to get us started.
Thanks, Kim. Waiting for the slide to come up here.
You'll need to click over on a new tab, Terry, the one that says Diakonia. There you go.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. On behalf of Roy and myself, this is Terry. As Kim mentioned, I was task force chair and Roy is the reporter. We had a number of other people throughout the denomination in both U.S. and Canada, part of the task force, and this is the culmination of almost 3 years of our work. And so thank you for joining. We've got, at least in the registrants, we had pastors, elders, deacons, Canadians, Americans, men, women, so a good diverse group of people. Hopefully I think there were also a few people that are going to be delegates to Synod that were registered for the webinar, so welcome.
And Terry, I'm just going to ask you to turn up your volume just a little bit. We got a little note that you're a little bit quiet, so just speak a tad louder, please, for our recording.
Okay, thanks, Kim. Just to give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering, the task force report was 35 pages in the agenda for Synod. We can't possibly cover all that material, but we're going to give you a brief overview of the mandate of the task force. We'll summarize what we did and what we didn't do. We'll give you an overview of the results of some of the research that we did. We'll highlight the guiding principles that our recommendations are based on, and we'll give you some highlights of some of the recommended church order changes and other recommendations that the task force is recommending to Synod. And there'll be a few breaks throughout our presentation that we'll pause and take your questions at that time. So, our mandate. Our mandate came from an overture from Classis Granville, and it was to review the articles of the church order relating to the office of deacon at church level and the major assemblies, to recommend resources that encourage revitalization of the diaconate and its role in the community, and the intent of the review would be to encourage, empower, and educate churches and broader assemblies to structure their diaconal ministry in ways that allow for effective coordination of ministry efforts that transform the community and the church as members minister in and with their community. This harnesses God's gifts in the community for community benefit. And the gifts of churches and their members, as well as the gifts lying dormant in the community, need to be stewarded. Also involved is selecting leadership based on gifts commensurate with the office and vision for ministry, leading church members to exercise their gifts and so enhance their own faith walk as they minister in various ways, establish terms of deacon tenure that provide for consistent ministry oversight, implementation and coordination, and probably the part that gets the most focus and attention, and we'll be, not only focusing on this, but the main part is addressing the place and role of deacons at the broader assemblies, meaning Classis and Synod. The overture from Granville gave 3 different grounds for their request for Synod to undertake this work. The current structure and tradition don't address the ministry context or the expectations of the equality of office established in Church Order 2. The mandate and the charge to deacons is difficult to fulfill given the language in the church order currently, and past efforts to address this, which goes back, Roy can probably mention this later, it goes back 40, 50 years, asking for just for example, asking for stronger diaconal committees at the classes level, haven't resulted in churches being the agents of transformation in their communities. There are a number of things that we were not asked to do. In other words, we were a task force and not a study committee. A study committee would get into biblical, theological, historical reasons for permitting the seating of deacons at major assemblies. Those arguments have been made frequently and persuasively in the past over decades of time. We've included a fairly brief historical synopsis in our report, and on our website, which we'll highlight at the end of the webinar, there's other documents on our website that give a more comprehensive history. So Synod 2010, who gave the task force, and put it into existence, Synod 2010 assumed the legitimacy of the argument to permit deacons at major assemblies. So what we did was we did an examination of the Bible's teachings about Diakonia, educated ourselves about the church order and various commentaries. We articulated a set of guiding principles, which Roy will be covering a little bit later, that would shape our proposals and guide Synod's deliberations. And we did do a review of the history of CRC study committees and synodical decisions about the role of deacons at major assemblies. That's highlighted in our report, and there's more detailed information on our website. So a couple things we also did was we gauged the mind of the church related to how deacons and diaconal ministry is viewed using a fairly comprehensive online survey using the Calvin Social Research Center. We began to gather various resources to enrich the church's diaconal ministry, but we realized soon that the scope of the time we had, the people and resources that we had, we couldn't really do a comprehensive gathering of resources, but we did start that. We reviewed various other materials such as liturgical forms and leadership guides, and we did receive some assistance from some advisors. So Kim, I think this is where we're going to pause and see if there's any questions or comments that people have.
Haven't seen any questions or comments just yet, but I just want to mention for those people who've just joined the webinar that this is being recorded, and in addition to the recording and some of the resources that Terry has just mentioned, we'll have copies of the slides from today's presentation also available all in our webinar archives by tomorrow. So you'll be getting a link after the webinar that's going to point you to all those resources that Terry's just been discussing, and along with the recording of today's event. So Roy, I've given you slide control, so I believe it's over to you now.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I guess for some of you it's good afternoon. Just one comment where Terry was just recently speaking about the fact that we began gathering resources. We actually hired an intern to collect material, and there's the beginning of a pretty extensive database of both printed literature as well as websites and interactive sites and coalitions and so on that's being developed, and we've made a pretty good start towards that. What I'd like to do now is, Terry mentioned that one of the things that we had done as a committee was to gauge the mind of the church. We contracted with the Calvin Center for Social Research, and they helped us compile a large survey, and that was available online. Maybe some of you actually participated in the survey, and the results of that are kind of extensive. There's a couple of summaries available online, and what I'm going to do now is just provide you with a very quick sketch of some of the more interesting conclusions of that survey, or the findings of that survey. One of the questions we asked was, we invited people to reflect on the nature of the work of the diaconate in their various congregations, and as the slide that you're looking at right now indicates, they were asked to comment on 3 phases, perhaps, you might think of it that way, or 3 concentric circles of of involvement. Deacons are involved in relief work, giving a fish, or they're involved in teaching people how to fish. That is mentoring and educating people who might be recipients or beneficiaries of diaconal outreach. And thirdly, deacons are involved in community development issues and perhaps justice advocacy. And the results of that you can see there. The diaconate at my church is generally speaking not involved in helping to change the system, but very involved in doing relief work. We'll go to the next one here. When it comes to the performance of the diaconate in these three categories of mercy and benevolence, or community development, or of justice advocacy, which you might think of as, addressing. So, for example, if you thought of mercy and benevolence as perhaps giving somebody money in order to help pay the rent, and if you thought of community development as educating or equipping a person to maybe better manage her finances, or perhaps acquire the kinds of skills necessary to afford housing, and then justice advocacy might actually be engaging citizenship or engaging civil society in efforts to change certain housing policies, or to advocate for more low-income housing in a certain area, making housing more affordable. So those are three different levels of ways in which churches can be involved in transformation of their community. And as you can see from this survey, that most respondents to the survey thought that their deacons did extremely well, generally speaking, at mercy and benevolence, and moderately well in community development, but not so well when it came to doing justice and justice advocacy, structural kinds of questions. The performance of the diaconate in terms of mercy and benevolence, as you see here, 77% thought they did, or 96% really thought they did extremely well, very well, or fairly well. When it comes to community development, not so well or not well at all, 49, just about half, and about 34% were generally unsure, fairly well, indicating not exactly sure how they're performing. And in justice advocacy, you get here we've got 54% not well at all, and fairly well 22%. So generally speaking, the conclusion that we came to from this survey was that the simpler the task and the more basic the task, such as arranging and scheduling for offerings and distributing resources to members of the congregation and perhaps to the community, deacons do very well. As the tasks become more complex and more engaging and more demanding, deacons tended to do less well, and respondents were less satisfied with the role of deacons in the church as that increased. So as the task became more complex. Here's the question: satisfied? How satisfied are you with the role that deacons play in the community? And it's kind of a wash between agree and disagree, with a large portion of people being neutral and perhaps uncertain. And as Terry mentioned, probably one of the more contentious recommendations that our report is making is the proposal that deacons be represented at the major assemblies of the church. And so we asked the question of our constituents, what's your opinion about deacons being seated at classes and at synods? And here's the results for deacons being seated at classes. 65% agree or strongly agree, 13% either strongly disagree or disagree, and 20% neutral. So quite a strong endorsement for the seating of deacons at classes. And when it came to synod, the numbers, quite a large portion of people are a little bit uncertain about that. So 31% neutral, fully though 47% that are in favor of deacons being seated at classes. And we try to also gauge the attitude of churches and of deacons themselves towards their own office. And so through a variety of questions, we came at this, and so the way that you might frame this is there still a perception in the churches that deacons are merely elders in training? And thankfully, 48% disagreed or strongly disagreed with that. But disappointingly, 18% were neutral, and 32% still had a strong agreement with this idea that deacons are simply elders in training, indicating in our minds that there's not a very strong affirmation of the diaconal role among those recipients, at least. And so our conclusion from the survey is, as you see there, simpler tasks are done frequently and well, such as mercy and benevolence. The more complicated tasks, such like community engagement and justice advocacy, are done less frequently, and the perception is that they are done less well. And in addition to that, I would say that in addition to that, the survey, and you can read the whole thing online, there was a strong sense that deacons generally do not receive adequate training for these more complex tasks, in spite of the fact that there's probably more training material available for deacons than there is for elders in the churches. Deacons at classis and synod, it was believed, would enhance the work of deacons. It would elevate their participation in the leadership of the church, and it would enhance the ministries of the church. We also researched diaconal committees. At one time, diaconal committees were much more prevalent than they are in our denomination today, and there's only a few diaconal conferences that are still operating, and these are in Canada. And so we checked with them, and we also, by the way, our research was corroborated by the input of a number of advisors, both in Canada and the U.S., who received interim reports from us, and who were the first ones to review materials that we had, and who gave us lots of feedback as we went along. We also reviewed the reference to service in the creeds and confessions, and what we discover there is predictably that there is not a lot of reference at all to, not only is there very little reference to service and diaconia in the historic creeds, but there's very little reference, in fact, to the mission of the church. This changes when you get into the more contemporary confessions. Both the contemporary testimony and the Belhar confession address the diaconia of the church quite extensively and in quite a challenging way. And the third part of our research was a historical survey. So what we did was we reviewed all the previous study committees and advisory committee reports that have been presented to Synod since the inception of the Christian Reformed Church. And it is to that summary that I will turn now, but first we can maybe just ask Kim whether there are questions that come out of the survey material. I see that there are quite a few questions here, lots from Johannes, but I wonder if there are any that relate directly to the survey material.
Not survey specifically that I can see right now, but there was a question that was tracking with you where you were a couple slides ago. Henry's just wondering what response the committee has had from classes since the release of the report.
Well, I think there's one overture that has been sent to Synod that disagrees with the recommendations that have been made. I know that there are several classes that have endorsed the report and that are urging Synod to adopt the recommendations. For example, Classes Alberta North, I know, and I believe Classes Alberta South as well, have submitted correspondence to Synod in favor of adopting the recommendations. Maybe, Terry, do you know more about that?
No, that's basically it. There was one overture, 3 communications, and they were split half and half, for and against. And so the input was given directly to Synod and not to the task force.
Okay. So let me just very quickly maybe go over some of the historical material. I will say that it was sort of fun to review all of these historic documents and trace the mind of the church over the decades. Generally speaking, historically, almost all the study committees that have met over the past 40 or 50 years have made strong recommendations to Synod to enhance, elevate, strengthen the work of deacons, and to recognize the integral role that deacons play in the ministry of the church. And many of them have also made the recommendation that deacons ought to be seated at both classes and at Synod. And very consistently, Synod has accepted all the recommendations of the study committees except those recommendations that permit the seating of deacons at classes in Synod, generally speaking. And the trajectory of our denomination's attention to that question, the trajectory was really towards seating deacons at classes in Synod until that all got derailed by the question of women in office. And then suddenly that question was put on hold. It seemed to be in the mind of the church that while we might want to seat deacons, if women are going to be deacons, then we need to postpone any decision to do that. Now that those questions about the participation of women in the offices of the church is more or less behind us, and all the church order articles have been amended to reflect our new position on that, we think it's time to sort of pick up that trajectory again. And as Terry mentioned at the beginning, one of the things we were not asked to do was to make the theological and biblical arguments for permitting deacons to be represented at major assemblies. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that in the history of the church, that argument has been made repeatedly and persuasively. And so we did study that history, and I sort of tongue-in-cheek, when I made my first report to the committee about that, I called it promise and unfulfillment, because all of the advisory committees and all the study committees basically recommended that, but when it came to Synod, which of course is attended only by elders and ministers, that never really came to be. And I do have a quote here from the 1967 report that I thought was worth highlighting, where the study committee said, the delegation of deacons to major assemblies will not immediately bring diaconal service into larger attention and interest through our churches. This also answers some of the questions we received earlier about what will be the impact on church ministry if we adopt the recommendations. It's not going to happen immediately, but the report goes on. If we recognize that the church is a united body and that all of its work is interrelated, that the scope of the ministry of mercy has taken on large global dimensions in our day, and keep in mind this is 1967, and what was true then is even more true today. And that the very presence of deacons at major assemblies can serve to focus the attention of the church on the fact that our compassionate Savior wills that the work of mercy shall stand in the center of the full interest of the church. Then the presence of deacons at major assemblies can be a step in the direction of honoring Christ more fully in his compassion and mercy. The church has a great responsibility to show the mercy of Christ both in and to our troubled world. Let deacons be involved at the level of decision-making to project the image of compassion and mercy in the church to a sick and despairing world. And Dr. de Ritter writes in 1982, and by the way, for any of you who are planning to attend Synod and want to prepare yourselves for the discussion about our report, I would strongly recommend reading the 1982 report by Dr. Ritter, because what he does there is he does a very good interpretive summary of previous study committees. The time in which we live provides almost unlimited opportunities for the development of the office of deacon. It would be a severe loss to the church if the diaconal office is further subsumed under that of eldership. And Dr. de Ritter, if you didn't know, taught church polity at Calvin Seminary for many, many years. Any questions about the history? Just, I see there are more questions on the side.
There are questions, but they aren't particularly about the history. They were some of the questions that came in on the registration forms that we reviewed earlier, and we're just going to hold those for the Q&A at the end, if that's all right.
Yep, good. That's very good. So let's move on to the guiding principles. So out of our biblical and theological reflections and out of the material that we gleaned from historical documents, we attempted to articulate a handful of guiding principles, and we were pleasantly advised in this also, I should say, by Henry DeMoore, the recently retired professor of church polity and the author of the recent church order commentary. And so our principles are as follows. The first principle is to recognize that it's not just that the church has deacons, but rather to reframe our concept of this by saying that the church is itself called to diakonia. In a sense, we could say that the whole church is a deacon. And we've made as our touchstone in Scripture the passage from Ephesians 4, verse 12. And there you see a portion of that. The gifts of God given to the church are there to equip the saints for diakonia and for building up the body of Christ. And we think that this is a better theological and scriptural anchor for our reflections on diakonia than what has traditionally been used, which is Acts chapter 6. I know that somebody asked a question about Acts chapter 6. But you know, really, and that's often referenced as as kind of a proof text for the role of deacons as serving on tables and serving the widows. And I think we all know the background of that, where the Greek women were being neglected, and so 7 were appointed to serve those tables. But nowhere in Acts chapter 6 really are those people called deacons. The study report of 1966 says that really Acts 6 should not be used as a reference for that, and at the very least, at the most, all of that it does is maybe talk about the inauguration of a certain kind of a diaconal role, but certainly doesn't speak to its further and fuller development in the life of the church. Interestingly, too, at the end of Ephesians and elsewhere, the whole life and ministry of the Apostle Paul is called diakonia. And so our first guiding principle is to say, look, the church doesn't just have deacons, but the whole church is called to diakonia, and the proper role of deacons in the church is to equip the church, equip the whole church, all of its members, for a wide range of ministries of service. So that's guiding principle number 1, and there may be some questions that we can talk about that. Number 2, we say that more than charity and the giving of alms, which would really be kind of an Act 6 characterization of diakonia. Diakonia is the mission of the church in living out God's reconciling love. Very strong emphasis of that in both the Contemporary Testimony and the Belhar Confession, working for justice and peace, and leading the church to participate in the mission of God. So we envision diakonia, the whole ministry of the church, as being significantly more than the truncated role that many people see deacons as performing, taking the offerings and distributing alms. Number 3 is that the language of the Articles of the Church Order should reflect justice, reconciliation, and peacemaking, and be consistent with the Contemporary Testimony and the Belhar Confession. As I said earlier, we reviewed the historical documents. There's very little in the creeds and the 3 forms of unity about the mission of the church, and certainly very little about anything in the specific offices. The Contemporary Testimony and the Belhar Confession compensate for that lack by addressing these very explicitly and fully, as do the forms for ordination. And so we are recommending that we change the language of the articles in the church order to be more consistent with the language of our Contemporary Testimony in the Belhar and the language that we already use in the forms of ordination. Guiding principle number 4 relates to the parity of the offices. And here's a quote from Henry de Moore from his commentary on the church order. He said, "It can be argued, therefore, that the CRC&A is gradually moving toward the view that it is a person's ordination as such and not his or her specific office or mandate that qualifies a person for delegation to classes. Or to put it another way, the CRC&A may finally be drawing the logical conclusions regarding the parity of offices." Historically, in the previous study committees, have affirmed this also. Particularly, there are a couple of strongly worded, strongly supported arguments that say that both elders and deacons are called to service, and with the appointment to service comes a corresponding authority. So it's not the case that elders have authority and deacons do the service, but deacons are called to a certain form of service and are given authority for that service, as are the elders. And so that lies behind the principle of the parity of offices, which was especially well articulated in the 1973 report on office bearers. Deacons should be appointed based on this one. Deacons should be appointed as delegates to serve in major assemblies of the church. That's our guiding principle. The council of each church shall delegate a deacon in addition to a minister and an elder, provided the classes approves of the delegation of deacons to its meetings. Deacons delegated to classes shall be given credentials identical to those given to ministers and elders. The gender of diaconal delegates to the classes shall be consistent with the decisions of that classes concerning the supplement to Article 3A of the church order. This was a decision taken in 1997, which permits deacons to be seated at classes. And as you'll hear in a moment, our recommendations endorse this and want to take it to the next level. Guiding principle number 5 is that the representation of deacons at the major assemblies is not about a power balance as such, but rather it is about the full representation of the whole church which these offices represent. When only ministers and elders are present at the deliberative assemblies, the whole church is not present there. And in fact, we end up having ministers and elders having to make decisions about diaconal ministries of the church, responsibility that is more properly performed by deacons. And therefore, our concern is not that there be a balance of power and interest as though we were playing some kind of political game here, but this is really about making sure that the full range of the ministries of the whole church is represented at the major assemblies. And our guiding principle number 6 is what I'm calling minimal regulation for maximum engagement. John Calvin states, "If the church requires it, we may not only without offense allow something to be changed, but permit any observances previously in use among us to be abandoned." So John Calvin and many others have recognized that, historically, arguments have been made saying that scriptures do not prevent deacons from being at major assemblies, and those who dissent from that say, well, scripture does not demand the seating of deacons at major assemblies. Of course, overlooking the fact that scriptures don't actually talk about classes or synod. The principle here of freedom that Calvin invokes is that the church has a freedom in the spirit, and this is evident also in the New Testament, to organize itself as it needs to in order to meet the needs of its day and to exercise the full gift of the Spirit for ministry. So those are the 6 guiding principles, and I think at this point, Terry Woodnorth is going to take over again and lead us through the recommendations.
And just before Terry takes over with the next batch of slides, Roy, we had a question that was relating to guiding principle number 3, and I'll read that. That was change the language of the articles of the church order to reflect justice, reconciliation, peacemaking, and be consistent with the contemporary testimony, the Belhar Confession, and the forms of ordination. Johannes sent in the observation earlier that he thinks the committee's recommendations move too quickly to church order implementation, and he's wondering what about having Synod endorse those 6 principles that you list in the report that might then get us ready for the church order articles.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks for the question. Our mandate was not to prepare guiding principles, actually. Our mandate was to visit the church order and recommend changes to the church order. So, you know, and again, I think that the Synod of 2010 was assuming the legitimacy of the argument for that. And so we prepared these guiding principles as a way of attaching our recommendations to some theological and biblical grounds, but our mandate really was not to prepare guiding principles, but to recommend changes to church order. So that's why we're moving directly to that. And that seems to have been generally well received, given the feedback that we've gotten for the report and from our advisors. So this is really what Synod has asked for. I hope that answers your question, Johannes.
Okay, and now over to Terry.
Okay, thanks, Kim Roy. Okay, now to our recommendations, and I can't possibly, in the time that we have remaining, cover all the church order, article changes, and form for ordination changes, and things like that. And so I'm just going to give some highlights. The refocus on Ephesians 4, verse 12 is actually put into Article 1 of the church order. So if you look at our report, you can see that it's actually referenced there. In addition to the doing things orderly and in good order there, we've included that. We've included flexible terms of service, and I'll touch on this in just a minute, but Article 25A talks about terms of service. It was already flexible, and I'll talk about, you know, the additional things we added there. Mutual accountability and strengthening the office of deacon in council, really, it should say. That is done in Article 35, where deacons have always been accountable to the council, and now we're just saying, well, consistory should also be accountable to the council. Kind of this mutual accountability. A broader mandate for the deacons in the church order, we'll cover that in Article 25C. Deacons at classes. Currently, we did a survey and got some information that approximately half of the classes now delegate deacons to classes. And so Article 40 will now make that a requirement. Article 42, deacons involved in church visiting. I probably should put in there the word optionally. In other words, we've reworded the Article 42 that would allow classes, if they so desire, to include deacons and not just elders and pastors and church visiting. And then Article 45 is how we address deacons at Synod. There were a number of other articles that we made changes to, including the whole concluding set of Articles 73 to 77 that talk about the denomination at the church, classes, and denominational level in regard to ministry. We probably won't have time to address those today, but refer you to the report to look at those. So, talking about terms of service, like I said earlier, Article 25 had quite a bit of flexibility in it already. It didn't say what the terms should be. There was flexibility there. We've added what we have here in highlighted, basically kind of given the rationale for this flexibility. Lengths of terms should be appropriate for continuity and succession of ministry leadership, for accountability for ministry outcomes, and the regular infusion and flourishing of gifts as the Spirit endows each generation. So we haven't made any more flexibility that was already there, but kind of just putting it into the context of why you want to be able to have that type of flexibility. And we didn't want to put elders and deacons separate. We didn't want to have a separate article and say, well, keep the wording for elders the way it is and change the wording for deacons. And so we've given that additional type of language where the flexibility was already there applies to both elders and deacons. Article 25C, 25B is the job description of elders. Article 25C is the job description of deacons. And so we've expanded the job description of deacons to be broader than mercy and stewardship. We don't have if you go back to the church order, what the original Article 25C talks about, it basically talks about mercy and stewardship. And so we now say, deacons shall lead the congregation in ways that inspire faithful stewardship of their time, talent, and resources, and so give life in this world the shape of God's kingdom by calling the members to be ambassadors of reconciliation in all areas of life. Thus, deacons shall create and encourage participation in structures and ministries that use members' gifts in areas of compassion, community transformation, creation care, justice, stewardship, and pastoral care, both locally and globally. Now, just make a note there. We added pastoral care in there because if you go to Article 65 in the church order, we noted that that article about pastoral care says it's the duty of all office bearers. And so this is, again, making the job description of deacons consistent with other places in the church order. The Article 25B, when it talks about the job description of elders, it includes pastoral care. And then when you go to Article 65, it talks about pastoral care for all office bearers, and so that's why we also included it in the specific job description of deacons in Article 25C. So now the big one, so to speak, that probably a lot of the focus is on. Right now, the current Article 45 says each synod sends representing the churches of all classes. Each classis shall delegate 2 ministers and 2 elders to the synod. And so we did discuss various methods of how to incorporate the delegation of deacons to synod, and our recommendation is that each classis delegate 1 minister, 1 elder, 1 deacon, and 1 other office bearer to the synod. And so we had 3 different rationales for that choice. One is now each office is represented, and that goes back to the guiding principle that Roy referred to. Either it's not the balance, but that it's the full representation of the church. The number of delegates remains the same at 4, so we haven't increased because, I guess you could say for pragmatic reasons, increasing the delegation by 50% would probably be a barrier, but that's, synod is welcome to talk about that. But then the 1 other office bearer, so in other words, we've got the 1-1-1, now you've got a 4th slot. We're giving classes the flexibility to determine the balance it desires. And if synod, for example, wants to say, well, executive director or board of trustees or somebody else wants to tell each classis, who to send, what that 4th slot should be, they can do that. But we're going, at least right now, for our recommendation to be maximum flexibility. Excuse me just a minute. So maximum flexibility is our reason for having the 4th delegate to be just 1 other office bearer decided by each synod. And then, there's many other church order articles that we could talk about, and I refer you to our report to look at them in more depth. The next important part is how are we going to resource this revised vision of Diakonia? Our first recommendation is that World Renew would take the lead role in facilitating collaboration and networking to support these decisions, to support deacons, to provide training. And there was an earlier mention about being a top-down type of recommendation with World Renew. We don't see World Renew as now saying, this is the edict, that this is how it must do, but World Renew is the convening agency, so to speak, to enhance and provide the training support and the structure for reinvigorating deacons in the denomination.
It might help at this point too, Terry, just to clarify that that's a decision that we came to in very close consultation with our advisors and with the other agencies of the denomination.
Yes, in fact, we convened almost all of the major agencies of the denomination for a conversation at one point in time, and they're on board in terms of wanting to work cooperatively, so this isn't a minimization of any other agencies' involvement or the deacons themselves or classes themselves, just that World Renew logically and would take that lead coordination role. And then the executive director would have the responsibility to ensure that collaboration within the denomination, to integrate it into the strategic planning of the denomination, the goals, processes that are involved. And then the thought, assuming they agree with our timeline, that would then come to Synod 2014 the following year to report on progress related to that. And progress doesn't mean it's all figured out and done within a year. We realize in reality this is just the first step in terms of implementation. There's a lot of coordination, training, coordination, just how do we envision it? And so this is just really the first step to get things going. So just we're going to conclude here, and we can go to Q&As in just a minute, but how you can help, urge you to pray for, especially for the delegates to Synod, for understanding and wisdom and wanting to listen to each other and be able to express clearly thoughts and concerns. Make sure your council studies the report. There were some concerns earlier about how long the report is. It's 35 pages. It's not terribly long. If you want to skip the historical parts and things like that and focus on the recommendations, it's a lot smaller than that. So just encourage you to you and your council to study the report, make your voice heard. I guess that means just talking with each other among yourselves. Attend the Synod in person if possible, if you're interested and want to be involved in that way. It's my understanding, because this is one of the major agenda items on the agenda of Synod, it'll be webcast in an evening, so it'll probably be Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday evening of Synod that this will be addressed. You know, the agenda won't be set until Synod actually is in session. So the likelihood is that it'll be an evening session, and it'll likely be sometime between Tuesday and Thursday. And then just encourage your deacons not only to be involved in understanding and reading the report, but just encourage your deacons to embrace this new vision of diaconia. For further reference and study, the whole report is online. Our survey study data is online. I'll skip the song a minute. We have a kind of a rap type of theme song, and there's a link to it, and we're going to play it at the end so you can hear it, just something for fun. Our task force had its own website, and so if you go to crcna.org/diaconia, you'll see lots of resources and things that we've done and information that we've gathered over the time. And then specifically, I've got the link to the agenda for Synod 2013, which includes the task force report, the overture and communications regarding it. Okay, Kim, I think we're ready for questions now.
Okay, and you've got several questions waiting here. First is kind of a question observation asking for comments. Johannes says the report is very strong on the deed ministry of the church, and he's a little concerned that the CRC is becoming very focused on the deed ministry of the church, and the balance, word and deed, is being lost. Comments?
Well, I think that the more integrated word and deed are, the better it is. I think that we've labored, struggled with a dichotomy there for many, many years. I wish it was the case that the church was so caught up in deeds that we have to listen carefully for the word. I don't think that's the issue exactly. I think the issue is really about equipping all members of the church for the service of ministry in the world, and that ministry is both evangelistic and it's service oriented, and in many ways, there's all kinds of literature about this. The more integrated they are, the more effective word and deed both are. They need each other, and they're both expressions of the ministry of Christ given to the church. So I don't think that this moves us away from a deep commitment to proclamation. In fact, the language that we've used for diaconal ministry also includes prophetic language, and this is consistent with what the Forum for Ordination says. I don't know if that satisfies you, Johannes, but we could talk about that more if you want to give me a call or something.
Okay, and I just want to tell you, Roy and Terry, be sure to speak up a little bit so we don't lose you on the recording. Next question's from Phil, and he says, do the CO changes in general that expand the role of deacons disqualify more people from office than Scripture does? If we don't have members engaging in justice advocacy issues in our congregation, it seems that we would not be able to have deacons.
You want to try that one, Terry, or you want me to give it a stab?
Still reflecting on it here.
Okay. Well, my response would be to say that the assignment that's given in the church order isn't adding anything particularly new to the role of deacon as it's described in the Form for Ordination, or adding anything new to what the church is called to do, for example, in the contemporary testimony. The assignment of this justice advocacy or prophetic role, to be prophetic critics of waste and injustice, as the Forum puts it, and so on, are not meant to be exclusionary, and not meant to say that if you're not a seasoned justice advocate, you can't be a deacon. I think it's more intended to open up and broaden the vision of the church for what its deacons can do, what's possible, what's the fulsome role into which deacons can grow. And I think, Phil, in your next question, you actually sort of acknowledge that. You say, yeah, we want to get there, more community engagement, but how do we hold deacons accountable to that? And I wouldn't hold deacons accountable by virtue of, I don't think the church order is the mechanism for holding deacons accountable. I think that has much more to do with thoughtful, strategic planning within the church for its ministries, and then delegating to the various offices and to the membership, structuring ourselves for more effective, more fulsome, holistic ministry in the world. And then to the extent that there is accountability, it would come out of that congregationally led plan.
And just to add to that, that comprehensiveness of all the different aspects of a deacon isn't meant to direct to one individual deacon or even necessarily to one diaconate. I mean, the church's capacity, each individual diaconate's and church's capacity to address the different areas is going to be different. And so it's not a prescriptive list that you have to do all these things, but it's the challenge of this is the wide scope of ministry that you can be involved in, and match it up with the gifts in your congregation and of your deacons and the needs of the community that you're serving. And so it's broadening the vision as opposed to being prescriptive that you have to do all these things.
Yeah, I would add to that it's not meant to be exclusionary, but it is. I think it is also intended to be motivating. It's a way of saying to deacons, hey, don't settle for too small a job description. Think big. Think in terms of the needs of the world. I mean, the world that we live in today is it's a hurting place, and there are multiple needs at multiple levels, and the church has a huge task ahead of it. And our hope is that deacons will really find this motivating and inspiring, and say, you know, this is a calling that we have to live into and prepare ourselves for.
Okay, here's the last question we're going to have time for today, and it's from Jacob. Does the World Renew role in deacon support versus diaconal ministries? Please comment on the difference in the change that's been made there.
Yeah, that's a good question, and particularly pertinent, I think, to Canadians because of the role of Diaconal Ministries Canada. And the role of World Renew was discussed pretty carefully with Hans Cater, and Hans did say to us that he felt that that Diaconal Ministries Canada is sort of maxed out itself. It doesn't have more capacity to do more for, you know, and Diaconal Ministries Canada does a lot in terms of preparing deacons, equipping them, providing training and encouragement and so on. And but Hans also agreed that this was something larger than just Diaconal Ministries Canada and should be given to World Renew. I hope that answers your question, Jacob. And World Renew's role would not displace or supplant Diaconal Ministries Canada. It would come alongside that, but it would fill in where Diaconal Ministries Canada doesn't have the capacity to do more or to reach out into other communities, for example. That's where World Renew would come alongside. And World Renew would strengthen its relationship with DMC and provide additional resources and networking and capacity to DMC itself.
Okay. And Henry wrote in to say many thanks to Terry and Roy and the task force for all the work and the inspiring report. And at this time, I am going to close up the webinar with some additional information, and then we're going to return to this Q&A for any questions that are still in the queue. We're going to go a little longer today, but for those of you that need to exit, we just want to let you know the survey is going to pop up in a new browser tab just as soon as you exit the webinar today. Please let us know how we did. And you can continue the discussion about this in the Deacons Discussion Forum on the network at crcna.org/network. And we want to thank Ministry Shares for making this webinar possible. It's through the generous gifts of Christian Reformed churches that we can do this. And our next webinar also is about elders, elder visits in the 21st century. It's going to be also about elders. I've got elders on the mind now. It's not about deacons, it's about elders. Elder Visits in the 21st Century, presented by Pastor Bill Vanderhyde, and that's next week on Wednesday. So thanks for joining us today, and if those of you that have to depart the webinar now, we're glad you could join us. We hope you get to join us again in the future. And now we've got just a couple more questions in the queue that we didn't get to yet, and I will pose that next one now. Benjamin is wondering, it seems to me that perhaps part of the issue is the lack of the pastor being involved with the deacons. Does this hold true in the data?
Roy, did we
or Terry?
Yeah, I don't think that that's a question that we asked specifically in the survey. At least it's not coming to mind immediately. I'd have to go back into the larger report and just check that out. I mean, if you ask me about my personal experience or my impression of that, is that generally is the case, that pastors often meet with the consistory, and they're considered to be an elder, and maybe less time is spent with the deacons. I'm not sure exactly. I think that would be a really good question to research. We did talk in our conversations as a task force. We did say that invigoration of the office of deacon will require deep commitment by pastors as well. They are so influential in setting the agenda for a church and in terms of the preaching ministry and so on, that their commitment and their support will be vital. And for that reason, we wanted to also involve the seminary and so on. And so I concur with what you're suggesting there, but I can't say that we have survey data.
Just to address that from another angle, we did make two where we are proposing 2 church order changes related to the office of minister. Article 11, we've focused on, again, using a reference to Ephesians 4:12, where the minister is to gather in and equip the members so that the Church of Jesus Christ may be built up. And so we've added some more diakonia type language there. And in Article 12, the church order, we've included, again, for consistency with all the other articles, the minister with the elders and deacons shall exercise pastoral care. And then we're saying, and engage in and promote the work of evangelism and diaconal outreach. And so we've addressed that, where we're saying, you know, pastor, minister has to be engaged with deacons and diaconal ministry as well.
Okay, and on that same note, Henry shared that he can corroborate that most pastors do not spend time with deacons, but in the cases where they do, the deacons seem to flourish. So thanks for sharing that observation. Have another observation question from Johannes. At the classical level, you suggest that we add the deacons, thus each church will send 3 instead of 2 delegates. Sounds good. Why do you not simply suggest that we add deacons to synod, thus each class is sending 6 delegates instead of the present 4?
Yeah, I think Terry did address that during his report, but maybe you want to repeat that, Terry.
I mean, we did, I mean, I didn't say this specifically. That is one of the options that we considered, and if the advisory committee and synod wants to go that way, they're free to do that. It's just, we just felt, mainly for a pragmatic reason, is that let's not deal with changing the numbers. Let's see what we can do to be creative with the numbers, i.e. 4, that we're using right now. And so there isn't any principled reason why it should be 4 versus 6. For practicality reasons, that's what we thought. And if Synod has another mind, if they changed it, you know, with that recommendation, you wouldn't be changing our, you know, what we're recommending in substance. And so it's basically up to the mind of Synod, I would say, to actually decide what they want to do in terms of numbers.
Our advisors urged us away from 6, thinking that that would receive much more resistance. I can say that in my own classes here, in classes Alberta North, one of the arguments that gets made against the seating of deacons at classes is that it would be more costly and it would be difficult to find a venue. I don't think that's a very strong argument myself, but it does come up, and so recommending 6 delegates to Synod would increase the cost and complicate the logistics to the point where that may be a harder sell, we thought, than reconfiguring the 4.
Okay, and so we're going to conclude the Q&A now. There are a couple of observations that were sent in. They've been captured in a report, and they're going to be forwarded to Terry and Roy for them to address via email. And at this time, what I'd like to do is take us over to the song. So that those of you who are interested in hearing the special song that's been written particularly for deacons, I hope that you enjoy it. I'm going to play it now. And if you're listening to this as a recording, I want to let you know that this audio portion of the webinar right now is going to conclude. Although the people who are on the line right now are going to hear this song playing, it's not going to be part of the actual recording. So you'll need to use the link when you get to this portion of watching your webinar if you're doing so in the recording. So I'm going to play the song and display the lyrics as we go along here. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today, and we're going to end our webinar now, and we hope you enjoyed it and hope you'll be able to join us again in the future. Thanks again.